Hey, this is a Hakawati production. Hey, welcome to the Men's Room. I'm your host, Nadia Michelle, and I'm so glad you're here. Today is really good. That's because my guest is one of those exceptional people who make it their mission to try to make the world a better place. You've probably seen him on the news because he's built his career speaking out for justice and equality in the public eye. And I feel so honored that he took the time to have this conversation with me. So it's an especially fun show today, but there are many more to come, and if you don't want to miss out, be sure to subscribe to The Men's Room. He's known for his no-nonsense reporting on the Arab world, including at Al Jazeera English, HuffPost Live, and for Vice on HBO. In 2015, he was featured on the Arabian Business Power List of the planet's 100 most influential young Arabs. And before that, in 2012, he was featured on Forbes' 30 Under 30 list of young disruptors, innovators, and media entrepreneurs impatient to change the world. Joining us from Toronto, Canada, please welcome Emmy-nominated journalist, the very handsome Ahmed Shihab-Eldin. Well, hi, Ahmed.
Hi.
It's such a pleasure to have you. And first, I want to tell you, I actually studied journalism in college with the hopes of doing exactly the kinds of things that you do, covering things that are so important. I got a little sidetracked and ended up covering things that are less important, that have to do more with lifestyle and stuff. But I really love what you do, and I have total respect for what you do.
I appreciate that. Well, I'll just say, if I may, depending on how we categorize lifestyle, I think everything's important and everything connects. So for as much as I've covered, social justice and human rights, and people tell me all the time, I wish I had, a career where I could, talk about things that matter, like they're either, bankers or what have you. But I think everything connects, and, in this modern day, we all have a platform. And so I appreciate what you said, but I think we all have something to contribute.
Well, that's a very interesting perspective, actually. Just so people understand what you're about, let me ask you, why did you become a journalist in the first place?
That's a great question. Like many of us, when I was a kid, I used to always ask why. I was just very curious. And my dad's a nuclear physicist, my mom's an artist, so I could ask them about very different things and they would, answer me. And I think what happened is I just was incessantly curious. And once upon a time I think it was 1990, we were living in Kuwait, and we would travel every summer to California to spend the summer there. And we just so happened to get on a plane to spend the summer in California. And by the time we landed, 16 hours later, Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. And we landed and, it was all in, every TV in the airport had the war. It was the first televised war, of course, the first Gulf War. And long story short, that summer, I remember, of course, our family was glued to the TV because we were worried about what was happening. And I remember being 7 years old and, people coming to interview my parents because, of course, they were essentially refugees at this point, so to speak, forced out of Kuwait, unable to go back. And I remember a woman asking me about my grandmother with a microphone. And I was like looking at this woman at the age of 7. And I was like, why does she care about my grandmother? Like, why is she here asking us these questions? Like, why is she in our home? And I don't know if this is a story I tell or if it's the truth, but that was a very formative experience in terms of, empathy and kind of what the purpose is of journalism, which is, to inform and to educate and to, I don't know. It's a big question, and I don't know exactly why I went into journalism.
It sounds like that was a very impressive moment. That's funny how sometimes when you're young, it's, that one moment that really shapes what you aspire to for whatever reasons.
Yeah, I think also, quite frankly, I love to write. I just love writing as a kid, and I love storytelling. I know this is Hakawati, so I loved the kind of ritual of storytelling. And I think, I applied to journalism school kind of after undergrad, not knowing, why or what, or, when you're that young, you don't really know exactly what you want to do. And I got into Columbia, and I guess one thing led to another. When I was in Boston University, just quickly, I know that now I'm digressing. I was walking home one day in the cold, and I had been studying advertising because my mom had been in advertising, and I thought, I could do that. That sounds cool. I think my mom's, you know, career was awesome. So, and my professor told me, he kept me after class one day. He said, Ahmed, I have something to tell you. I said, what? He said, you're very talented, you're very smart, you're very inquisitive, but you suck at advertising. You're horrible. And I remember walking home and being devastated, at that age. Oh, I thought I was going to be in advertising. And I remember seeing a flyer on the window of the Daily Free Press, which was the student newspaper in Boston University. And I walked in, I applied for a job, got a job. And then from there on, I just got addicted to, reporting and going places and asking questions and thinking about what was said and trying to convey that to the world. I know it sounds kind of random, but yeah.
Yeah, and then the rest is history. From the moment you kind of set foot in that world, you kind of were like an overnight success, if I might say, right?
Not overnight, but I think I was always pushing against certain kind of conventional ideals in journalism. I think timing is everything in life, right? And I happened to be at Columbia at a time when the news industry was really changing and transforming around social media and, digital media and publishing. And I was kind of a geeky kid. I was more into like kind of action scripting and interactive kind of maps and all that kind of stuff and what a computer can do. And so, yeah, I think I was in the right place at the right time. And, they were trying to teach us, rightfully perhaps, at Columbia about objectivity and the view from nowhere, which used to be very important in journalism back when there were kind of authoritative voices that decided, what was news and what was information that was important. And I remember from an early age really pushing back at Columbia against this idea of objectivity, which I think is really just a guise, this idea that journalists should not allow any of their emotions or humanity to infiltrate into their work, as if that was even possible. So yeah,
Right.
I don't know, not an overnight success, but I was definitely fortunate and persistent.
That's really interesting because you've covered the Middle East, and it's such a hot topic, and critics always accuse certain networks and certain countries of covering issues in one way and conflicts in another, from their own perspective. But that's just the way it is, right? Because it's all a matter of perspective. For one country, maybe one side is to blame, and then for the victim, it's probably the other way around. So yeah, and I think that's what people really connected with in terms of the way you reported news when you were in the region. Of course, you're not in the region anymore. You're living in New York.
Yes, but I spend a lot of time in the region. It's funny. I'm about to give a speech tomorrow to about 400 young Arabs here in Toronto, and it's called Yalla, Let's Talk, the conference. And I mention this just because I'm speaking about something that I've never really spoken about publicly, and it's about how our attachment to identity causes a lot of our suffering. And it speaks to exactly what you're talking about, this idea that perception really does dictate reality, especially in this kind of, whether we want to call it a post-truth world or I don't know, this digital dystopia that we live in. And so, yeah, I guess I feel very connected to the Arab world is the point, despite not living there permanently. And the beginning of my speech, for what it's worth, is about how even though I live in the West and I dress Western, and I'm not going to rap the lyrics of the speech. I'm trying to do a little rap in this speech. But the point is I talk about how I somehow find release where there is no peace, referring to the Middle East. And so, even though I don't live there, it very much still feels like home and kind of where I belong, at least in some regards.
So you're gonna actually rap?
I'm not gonna rap. Let's just say I've spent a lot of time this year exploring new ways of storytelling. I think, back to our earlier point, there are so many different ways to tell a story. Dancers tell stories, artists, musicians, and I think after spending more than a decade kind of telling stories in the context of journalism, I'm really exploring kind of performance. And, since I was a little kid, I used to put on little performances every Friday when we'd go to our grandparents' house for lunch. And there's so many different ways to reach people. And my real purpose in storytelling is to shift people's perceptions away from kind of the dogma and the divisions that separate us, which the media unfortunately focuses on, and to focus on kind of the human condition and the shared things that we all have in common.
That's so interesting, because you're known as a journalist, but are
Yeah.
you feeling like there's just too much media? The media is doing, the same thing. We hear the same things over and over,
Hmm.
and people
Hmm.
are kind of becoming numb to it. So you make a good point. Is there a better way to kind of shape the way people think at things or about things or view certain issues? And actually, like, for example, I wanted to bring this up. There's the coronavirus that's happening in
Yeah.
China, for example.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think that that's an example of the media kind of, how can I put it, like taking a story and milking it for all it's worth because it has this fear that's attached to it, and they know the
Yep.
audience will be glued to their wherever they're listening to find out who else
Yeah.
got the virus. And is that an example of what you're talking about?
You're 100% on point. I think I grew very disillusioned with the limitations of journalism, especially today. And I think the coronavirus is a good example, right? I mean, I think the world is definitely going through two pandemics caused by the coronavirus. The first is the infection itself, and the second is kind of the panic and the hysteria and all the associated racism and xenophobia that's really been very explosive. I was just in a coffee shop the week after the news started, covering this virus. And I remember a woman walked in, and she was with her daughter, and there was an Asian woman who was, ordering. And I think she was even Korean. I don't think she was Chinese. But the point is, I watched as this mother, understandably on some levels, but also offensively and problematically, pulled her daughter away and very publicly was like, don't touch that woman, move away, because the woman was touching the glass.
Because
And
she was Asian, basically.
yeah, she was just Asian. And, I just wonder which is more threatening to the world. Is it the virus itself, or is it the hysteria that's being caused? Masks are selling out, even though masks aren't really effective in terms of protecting against the
Oh,
virus.
that's
And,
crazy.
schools and public places are being abandoned kind of when a Chinese or Asian person walks in. And, there's even countries that are kind of going against the WHO guidance of, not banning foreigners arriving from China. Science shows that these kinds of steps are ineffective in preventing the spread of any respiratory virus. And, in Italy, across Europe, all over the world, there's incidents of assault, of insults and boycotting of businesses. And this is racism, right? And it's driven by fear, to use the word that you used in the question. And, I think the biggest beneficiaries, to your point, are probably a lot of the peddlers of fake news and kind of the racist memes and the conspiracy theories around the virus that are spreading online, kind of faster than the disease itself is spreading, or the virus itself is spreading. And, the kind of tech giants who give these people a platform, and the advertisers then who piggyback off those profits. I think the winners are not just the pharmaceutical companies kind of profiting off of the hysteria. Their stock prices are surging in anticipation of how we're going to test and treat the virus. But, even the Trump administration has said they see a positive in the fact that the coronavirus is existing, because the Commerce Secretary in the U.S. was speculating that a pandemic would drive a return of jobs to North America. And so, I think it's too early to really know what's going on, but if you put things into context, the fatality rate of coronavirus right now, I think, is around 2.5%. SARS back in 2003 was 10%. The Middle East respiratory syndrome was 30%. And if you think about it, compared to the flu, which kills around 400,000 people every year, we we don't talk about the flu in the same terms, and unlike the coronavirus, of course, there's a vaccine for the flu. But, I'm not a scientist. I'm not trying to downplay the virus. It has killed 1,800 people, or however many it's a little bit more than that now. It's in 24 countries, but almost 99% of the deaths and the infections are in China. And, so I think we just, other than the fact that the incubation period, which is the time from being infected to showing symptoms is kind of long, 14 days. And that is a threat. And that allows people who are infected to kind of travel widely before showing symptoms. I think, yeah, it's a lot of, it's a product of what we're witnessing is a product of how news and information and misinformation travels faster than even a supposedly deadly virus.
Yeah, and so many people are making money off of this. It's kind of like during wars, certain countries like to go to war sometimes because it kind of stimulates the economy. It's almost a similar thing. And so if you think about that, and I know, you just mentioned conspiracy theories, but in your personal opinion, is there a chance that this virus was created in a lab and unleashed onto the population, to kickstart, some great business opportunities and also to quell the protests in Hong Kong? A lot of people have been saying that. What are your thoughts on that?
You're setting me up to be a conspiracy theorist. I think it's a good question in the sense that anything is possible. And I think we've seen crazier things happen and kind of more nefarious things happen. And I'm not going to kind of peddle that and say that it's probable. It is possible. But what I will say is that panic and fear is always profitable for someone. If you look back in the 70s, I think in 1976, the main kind of beneficiaries of the swine flu hysteria were the drug companies that were kind of pushing untested vaccines. And back then, a lot of people suggested maybe the same thing had happened in terms of like it being somewhat intentional.
And they're the ones that would be able to produce the virus in the first place, right? Because they have all those labs and they're always funding research.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't know. I don't want to push conspiracy theories, but I do think we live in a time when anything is possible, and people have proven themselves to care much more about money and profit than they do, the more important things in life, let's say.
It's crazy to think that that's actually a possibility and that people would actually do that to other human beings. But let's move on. I was looking through your Instagram the other day and I noticed you reposted part of Joaquin Phoenix's Oscar speech on your page. The part where he talks about equality between, all genders, all races, and all the creatures in the world, including animals, and how none of us creatures on the planet should dominate or exploit the others. Why did you repost that?
His speech really resonated with me as someone who spent more than a decade working in media, hoping to amplify kind of the voice of the voiceless, the most marginalized groups among us. He started his speech by expressing gratitude for having a career that gave him the opportunity to do the same thing. Now, whether that's true or not, in that speech and in many speeches, he touches on social inequality, the cruelty of the food industry towards animals. I mean, something very few of us ever think about, whether we're vegan or not. Systemic inequality and even kind of this cancel culture that we're living in online, right? And I've recently been taking acting workshops, studying acting, which is also, like journalism, the study of the human condition. And his speech came from a universal perspective, which I really respect, rather than an individual one. And it was very refreshing. I mean, I kind of admired how he asked viewers, and he took this kind of very, public platform to ask viewers to sacrifice more individually, to make kind of a larger difference in the world. And this is rare in Hollywood, right? Where ego and validation and recognition and individuals really tend to kind of be somewhat self-absorbed. And, he turned away, attention from himself and kind of towards others, especially marginalized groups. And whether it was sincere, which I think it was, or not, it came across as very authentic. And I kind of got a bit emotional because, I don't know, I felt so, I think he didn't even thank anyone who worked with him on Joker.
Mm.
Some people might be like, in the context of Hollywood, how rude. But he had, again, this bigger picture, right? This bigger perspective of kind of what we all as humans are facing. And rather than indulge his ego, he warned us of what happens when we fixate too much on ourselves and on our ego. And it was filled with kind of universal truths about the challenges we face that I think a lot of people, sweep under the rug, and we're caught up with our own lives. And I'm not judging people, but I think it's an important message that we don't hear that often. And let's also not forget that Joker was a very kind of divisive film. Like, a lot of people argued that it glorified violence and it didn't really offer much new, in terms of the conversation around that. And so I don't know. You could say that it's a bit ironic that he talks about like the social ills, but there's been a lot of kind of criticism, but also praise of him. And I think what resonated most with me, to just answer your question succinctly, is that I think when we're at our best, or we are at our best, I should say, when we support each other. And he kind of echoed that sentiment, not when we cancel each other out and when we attach so much to our identities and we want to kind of challenge each other for attention and for justice and dignity and freedom and all the things that we all deserve. And so, he talked about helping each other grow and educating each other and getting a second chance. And I really respected that. I thought it was humble and it was refreshing. And yeah.
It got so much attention too. I guess,
Mm-hmm.
it was kind of divisive because a lot of people kind of get turned off when people talk about,
Mm-hmm.
people who are, they get turned off by vegans, let's be honest, and they get turned off by people who are like too woke, right? There's like two camps in the world.
100%.
But it got a lot of attention because at the end of the day, people are so fed up with these boring speeches at the Oscars, I think. The ratings are
100%.
like going down the drain. So they're looking for something more meaningful. And definitely he had something really, that was meaningful to say. But let's talk about so the deal of the century that Trump thought he could get away with. We're shifting completely now. You've spent a lot of time covering the Middle East. You were, in fact, nominated for an Emmy for one of the shows that you did at Al Jazeera, I believe.
That's true, yeah.
So you have a lot of, you have quite a deep understanding of the history of the region. You're also of Palestinian descent, though you grew up in Kuwait, right?
100%. Yeah, well, I grew up in Egypt, but I'm a Kuwaiti citizen, and both my parents were born and raised in Palestine.
Okay. And you've lived all around the world. You've lived in the
Yeah.
States. So you're really a citizen of the world. But your understanding of the region is quite unique, I would say, in terms of what your work has been and because of your heritage. So
True. I mean,
yeah.
I think so. I don't know. I don't know if that's true. But
Everyone
I
thinks
do
so.
think so. Okay.
But what did you think when you heard about this so-called Swiss cheese state that Israel is offering the Palestinians? What were your thoughts, especially as a journalist and as a man of Palestinian descent?
I laugh, and I hate to laugh because obviously this is not a laughing matter, but I laugh just because of how almost effective it was and how the media bought into it, including Arab media. I mean, let's be clear. This was not a peace plan. This was political theater masquerading as a kind of so-called peace plan. And I think timing really matters in life and in politics. And obviously, it was a very welcome distraction from the kind of corruption charges that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu were facing. I mean, the day that it was announced was literally the same day that Netanyahu was indicted for fraud, bribery, and breach of trust. And I guess I think it's absurd to call this a peace plan, especially when Palestinian voices were not included. They were barred from the conversation. And I'm so exhausted by the world, especially the normalization that we're seeing in the Arab world, but specifically the media, the way the media covers this. I think it's a good example of what I was speaking about earlier, this idea of objectivity, this idea of like giving two parties, Israel and Palestine, equal kind of, like as if there's like only two sides to the story, and as if they should have equal right to not right, but equal input, and framing them as it disregards the kind of David and Goliath paradigm and dynamic between Israel and Palestine. I mean, this peace plan, I don't want to repeat for your viewers or listeners, but it would recognize Israel's illegal settlements, which are illegal according to international law, and the plan not only tears up like previous realities and truths in international law, but it really points to a kind of new geopolitical reality in the Middle East. And, you know, Palestinians would get just 70% of the occupied West Bank, and Israel can move immediately to annex more settlements. It's again, it's laughable. I mean, I don't want to even comment further. But the more important thing that I think I should say about this is that, you know, what I think a lot of people don't realize is that there's 450,000 Israelis who live on 250 illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. I mean, that's 500,000 people. And the kind of settlement planning and growth has grown 3 times since President Trump was elected. And so, you know, this plan is a plan for permanent occupation, for more apartheid policies. And, you know, there's even a section of the plan that involves like forcing the transfer of Israeli citizens who are Palestinian, you know, ethnically. So Israeli citizens would be, you know, forced to move. And this was once, you know, deemed so extreme, you know, the kind of racist idea. And it's kind of getting the full endorsement of the US. So it's very, very, very disheartening. And
What do you
I
mean
could talk
forced to
more.
move? What do you mean forced to move?
They would have to, the plan itself, you know, I don't know if you know, but the plan would force like Palestinian citizens of Israel out of Israel proper and into this so-called Palestinian entity, right? Forced to move, meaning they would not be allowed to stay there, even though they're Israeli citizens. That's like one of the kind of odd things about this plan.
I didn't even
And
know that. I don't think that was highlighted, you know, in the
no,
coverage.
it wasn't. I mean, it was a very long line. I think that was also purposeful, right? You
Hmm.
know, to kind of and one thing I'm going to say, if I may, I know I might not have too much time, but you know, the coverage of the plan shows how mainstream news media outlets, particularly in America, but also in the Arab world, are kind of sensitized against any reference to Palestinian rights or dignity or international law. You know, a lot of the early reports included both the phrase peace plan and deal of the century, you know, phrases that you just used, you know,
Hmm.
you know, and journalists failed to kind of use quotation marks because that's all it is. You know, these are phrases that are coined by the administration. You know, and I think, you know, this draws attention to how important it is to contextualize stories and contextualize news, and how we frame things is very important. And, you know, I don't mean to call out news organizations, but BBC, Reuters, the New York Times, AP, all of the mainstream organizations kind of fell into this trap that was kind of propagated by the Trump administration of kind of like, you know, how can I put it? You know, there are internationally acknowledged rights, right, of Palestinians in the pre-1967 borders. And the way that it's phrased in the media is Palestinian claims or ambitions or hopes. No, this is something that decades ago has been established and codified into law, into international law. So why are we using these terms? You know, what is the purpose and the intention behind that? You know, the New York Times also described the Jordan River Valley, which was occupied in 1967, as strategically important to Israel. Okay, but then why refer to Israel's kind of intended annexation of illegal settlements without mentioning the occupation or the 1967 borders? So, you know, in journalism, what we choose to include, what we choose to not include, how we call things, unfortunately, really matters in shaping people's perceptions. And I want to also say, if I may, that, you know, as a journalist who's tried to cover this story, it's been very challenging, and things are shifting a little bit in America. But when things shift, people fight back, right? And so we've seen pro-Israel groups in the States and around the world consistently work to conflate Judaism with Israel. And so what they do is they delegitimize anybody, journalists in particular, who question or criticize the policies of the Israeli government as anti-Semitic. I know you know this. And so, you know, sadly, Arab journalists are falling for it too. I don't know if it's convenience, economic kind of geopolitical ties are now forming between, or solidifying, I should say, between Arab states and Israel. And Arab media is failing to ask questions about the rights of refugees, of, you know, people living in East Jerusalem, and what kind of quote unquote state Palestinians would have. Al Arabiya, NBC, so many Arab news outlets gave Jared Kushner unchallenged kind of airtime on the day of the announcement, and he explained his plan to Arab audiences. And, I think I'm really sad to not see more of a kind of sophisticated conversation. It was all platitudes, and it was offensive to anybody. Forget the fact that I'm Palestinian and a journalist. I think it's the way it was portrayed and presented by the media is offensive to anybody who is familiar with the very basics of the conflict, let alone anyone who's been on the ground there. I always tell people, if you want clarity about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, just go there. Just go not to Israel only, but go to the West Bank, go to Jerusalem, and you can feel it. You can't fake the feeling of injustice and dehumanization.
Well, you've made such a good point, especially about how, they've really mastered, politicians have really mastered using the media and using language. I mean, you're right. I never thought about that. If you call it the deal of the century, and of course, journalists are going to call it that because that's the official name, but then you're kind of putting in people's heads that it's this great, fantastic deal that's going to change, the world forever. So that's really
100%.
interesting. But you also mentioned normalization, and that's what you're kind of talking about now. Do you feel like the Arab world, they've always been kind of critical, or they've always kind of supported their brothers, in Palestine. But it feels now like they've kind of become complacent, and everyone's kind of tired of this issue, and they're kind of like sweeping it under the rug. Would you say that that's kind of true? And how do you see this playing out in the region if the deal goes through? How do you see it playing out?
Nadia, you used the word complacent, which is right, but I would go further. I would say complicit in the occupation and in the dehumanization of Palestinians. And I also would, and I made a documentary for Vice on HBO, the first ever kind of documentary about Israel and Palestine from the Palestinian perspective. And even though I regret some of the choices that they made in terms of the finished product, what was very clear is that a majority of the youth, and I think the Palestinian population in general, see the Palestinian Authority itself as complicit in the occupation. So the normalization has existed between Israel and Arab countries, as well as the Palestinian Authority, which is not just complicit, but benefits from the occupation, financially. And so, yeah, to kind of sum it up, I mean, I think that these developments we're talking about normalization, coincide with the announcement of this so-called deal, right? Egypt, Jordan are, the only Arab countries that actually have public diplomatic relations with Israel. But, Israel, now Israeli citizens can travel to Saudi. And I think vice versa. I'm not entirely sure. I don't want to, give you misinformation. But Israel, announced its participation in the Expo in Dubai and the UAE in 2020. And, the UAE just doesn't comment on the Israeli announcement. And there's a lot of ties behind the scenes in terms of, economic and security coordination. Ambassadors of the UAE, of Bahrain, of Oman, took part in the White House kind of unveiling ceremony of this so-called deal. We've seen so many ties, even with Morocco. There was a report that kind of Israeli aerospace industries were purchased for, I think, $50 million to spy on desert areas by the Moroccan government. The Emirati foreign minister as well has ties and has kind of, I don't know, I don't want to get ahead of myself and kind of, call out each specific country, but I think what we've seen...
No, please, someone does have to do that. I mean,
Okay,
people are not paying attention. That's what we were talking about earlier, right? No one's paying attention.
Well,
and as long as the dollars keep rolling in, everyone's willing to kind of close their eyes on,
100%.
on humanity, basically, on their own species. It doesn't matter because, unfortunately...
Yeah, it's very complicated, right? Because this is, and why I spoke about geopolitics, right? Because this deal, I think, did a lot of things that distracted away from the corruption that Netanyahu and Trump face, but it also kind of highlighted a shifting geopolitical reality in the Middle East, right? The normalization between Arab countries and Israel, which has been happening for some time, is kind of a desperate attempt at isolating Iran, right? And that speaks to other divisions in the region, right? The Sunni Shia thing, and how can I say this? I think I think it's a bit of a charade. I think, and it's not just because I'm a Kuwaiti citizen, but in terms of lip service, at the very least, for the last 5 or 10 years, at least Arab leaders used to kind of give lip service and criticize Israel and kind of advocate for the rights and the dignity and the justice that Palestinians deserve, and that stopped. Even the rhetoric has stopped. And I think that's partly because there are all these kind of normalization of ties, and it's shameful, and it's not just shameful um, because they're Arab brothers or what have you, but I think it's shameful because um, this is a conflict that I think is only going to get worse, and that's going to get worse for all parties involved, including Palestinians, Israelis, and the neighboring countries. I try to kind of hold on to hope in the sense that I think that people that are so dehumanized and so vilified and demonized and treated with such kind of injustice are never ever going to just sit down and take it, and there are powers, unfortunately, that I mentioned, for example, the Palestinian Authority, that benefit from the reality of kind of the warming of ties as well between Arab states. And so we as individuals have traded our privacy for kind of convenience when it comes to the internet and whatnot. And I think we're seeing Arab states trade kind of make a similar trade in terms of their policies on Israel and Palestine. And it's depressing, it's disheartening, but I think there's still hope.
So you mentioned that since Trump has been president, the settlements have multiplied. Do you think if we had a Bernie Sanders as president, things would be different? Things would change?
Yeah, I think things would be different. I think things would change. I think people who have supported Bernie, particularly people who care about this issue, might not be pleased with how quickly things would change. But I'll tell you this: things are shifting in America in the media. I've worked, for more than a decade for many U.S. mainstream organizations as well as others, and there used to be a time when you couldn't even kind of call a spade a spade. You couldn't criticize policies. The term occupied would never be used by any of the wire services. And, that's shifted. And you're starting to see a lot of Jewish Americans. I mean, Bernie Sanders, again, the only Jewish American political, kind of candidate running for president. And you're seeing people within the media take a stance. You're seeing people like Andrea Mitchell at MSNBC frame what's happening in Israel and Palestine when Arab members of the Israeli Knesset are kicked out. She tweets about, can you imagine if black members of the Black Caucus in Congress were kicked out? And we're starting to see, I think, a little shift in terms of what is permissible in terms of criticizing Israel. In a broader climate, of course, where the powers that are trying to limit that are actively working harder to actually make it illegal to boycott Israel or illegal to criticize Israel. And we've seen a lot of news stories in that context. But to answer your question, when it comes to Bernie Sanders, I think because he is Jewish, it almost affords him the right to be critical without being deemed anti-Semitic, right? And that is a very powerful and very manipulative tool that a lot of people use to deflect any criticism of Israel. But it can't really be used on him, right? Because he can't be anti-Semitic if he is Jewish.
Actually, they've called Jews anti-Semitic before, but I see what you're saying.
What I mean is I don't think that's the only
Jews,
reason.
yeah.
Yeah, of course, and there's self-loathing everything, but I think he believes that Israel and Palestinians can coexist. I think he's been very vocal in a way that no other candidate has been in terms of advocating for the rights of Palestinians to live a life of dignity. I mean, even that very basic thing, like you wouldn't hear it out of the mouth of someone like Hillary Clinton or some of the other candidates running this cycle. So I think that he will, and the way he speaks about Gaza, even though I'm not convinced that it's like indicative of a huge change that would happen if he were president. Just the kind of humanistic approach and the fact that he's not so unwilling to recognize the right for dignity and humanity for Palestinian people, and that he has consistently referred to it, is, it's sad to say that that alone is a positive sign, but it is.
So you're seeing some rays of light from the political side in America, at least, and you're seeing a little bit of hope also in the way the media is covering it. Does that mean you'll consider working in the media in the U.S.? Is that something you're thinking about, or are you considering a total shift of career? What are you doing? What are you working on?
Good question. I really think that I will always be a storyteller, and I'm not trying to dodge the question. I think journalism is also evolving. The way in which the kind of parameters within which we can call something journalism is shifting. The way in which people consume, news is shifting, and I think I'm at a point in my life where, I'm 35. I've been working for, again, like maybe almost 15 years in the media. And I just think that if you think of how, I mean, I could flip the question on you. I don't know how many times, Nadia, do you read a news article or do you even watch a documentary and find that it really shifts your perspective, or it really lingers with you for months and years in terms of something that you think about. And
I know what you're saying. I think people usually tend to gravitate towards the things that they already believe in. That rarely are people going to watch a documentary, or if they assume that it's going to be something they're going to disagree with, right?
Exactly. And I think what's happened is, I can't lie to you and say I'm not disillusioned with journalism, especially in this kind of post-Trump era, this fake news era. We often spend more time in media, for better or worse, focusing on what divides us, right? And this is really damaging for any chance of real change, of coalescing people to fight for change in a global way. And even though the internet was supposed to be a global village, in many ways, we're living in these kind of online gated communities. And, I remember back at the beginning of my career, you mentioned that I was nominated for an Emmy for my show, The Stream, on Al Jazeera. I mean, that was in the context of the Arab revolutions, right? This moment of hope and possibility. And social media was playing a real role in amplifying the voices of people who had been silenced and stifled. And now social media platforms, whether purposely or not, I think maybe inadvertently, have created kind of these online political cultures of maximal tribalism and infinite personalization. And, confirmation bias is a very real thing. People silo themselves in self-made realities that validate their attachments to what they believe and to who they are, to their own identity. And we all take part in kind of collective, expressions of outrage based on our identities and our kind of quote unquote tribal identities. And so the post-truth era is kind of one in which people are, whether knowingly or not, searching for information, to your point, that kind of confirms their political or ideological beliefs in this kind of digital dystopia that we're living in. And for me, I want to be effective. I have always wanted to, like, the reason I went into journalism is because I believed that through telling people's stories, through amplifying the voices of the voiceless, that I would be able to make a change in the world. And, once I was on a panel at South by Southwest a few years ago, and I was speaking about this topic in the Middle East, and some guy stood up and he pointed at me and he was like, "This guy, Ahmed Shihab-Eldin, is an activist. He's not a journalist."
But that's how journalism got started, right? I mean, that was initially why people became journalists. So it's kind of ironic.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate that, because for me, I thought it was laughable because, out of all the things I've been called in my life, I mean, being called an activist didn't offend me. I take kind of pride in it. But, let's just quickly, like, the definition of an activist is a person who campaigns for some kind of social change. And if you define campaign, it's to work in an organized and effective way towards a goal. So I would argue that all journalists, whether they want to admit it or not, even the so-called objective ones, are activists.
Exactly.
I think to reveal truths, to expose abuses of power, to promote understanding by providing context, as we spoke about earlier, we tell stories in journalism to find constructive solutions to the problems we all face, right? And especially in this era of fake news where facts unfortunately don't really matter and where fear kind of dominates, like I think we need to kind of journalism needs to be a little bit redesigned with context in mind, and with transparency and accountability
I think
in
he
mind.
called you an activist because you're saying things that he doesn't agree with,
Yeah,
probably.
and he probably called me an activist because I was saying things that were persuasive, things that were based in fact, and things that were because I was providing context and I was humanizing things that I think threatened his own sense of self and identity.
And that's why you're great at what you do, by the way, Ahmed, is because you always provide context. And that's why, we have you here today, is because you're able to talk about these things in a way that is persuasive and that's engaging and that makes sense.
I appreciate that. One last thing I'll say is just some questions, if there's time. I don't know how long this is going
Sure,
to be, but for
of
the
course.
audience to listen is, when it comes to media, when it comes to storytelling, like I definitely want to continue telling stories. I think I'm going to be doing it more in a performance capacity than strictly in a journalism capacity. And the reason is because I've been asking myself questions of, why is the media designed to tell stories that are motivated by fear? Why do we keep framing stories in these kind of familiar ways? Why do we focus on politics rather than people? In aspiring to be objective, the New York Times, for example, in its coverage of Israel and Palestine, like we're trying to tell both sides of a story as if any story only has two sides. Are we actually concealing truths? And I think my biggest frustration with media is how often depth, nuance, and context are sacrificed in this kind of 24-hour news cycle for speed and short attention spans and simplicity. So to answer your question of what am I working on, I'm working on tackling those questions and finding ways to break through kind of this new kind of climate of this kind of changing media landscape. And I applied to a fellowship actually at Stanford to do just that, which is to try and tackle some of the challenges, I should say, that we face, because I want to.
What kind of fellowship?
It's a fellowship, but it's a year-long fellowship where you live at Stanford and you basically come up with ideas, actionable ideas to tackle some of the they describe it as four major challenges facing journalism. They frame the four challenges as misinformation and disinformation, holding the powerful accountable, kind of strengthening local news, and fighting bias, intolerance, and injustice. And a lot of those speak directly to my experience, especially recently, and my frustration with journalism and media. And so, I think we'll see. I don't know. I I I could do many things. I might find myself. I'm writing also a kind of screenplay. I'm taking acting classes. I was just in Mexico doing an acting workshop, and again, I learned that acting, much like journalism, is really the study of the human condition, and my real passion. I love studying why we are the way we are, how we can change the way we are in order to change the world.
So are you an actor now?
It's funny. I think I've always been an actor. Maybe I've just been playing one character. I think we all act in life, and I know that's an easy excuse.
Yeah,
But
well,
no,
some of us act in life, but if it's time to
yeah.
actually
But
act,
like
it's a different story.
it's true. But for example, when I'm hosting a TV show, right? Um, it's not me. I mean, it is me, but I'm kind of adopting a persona of sorts. And I think we all, to your point, adopt personas in different contexts. And so maybe I've been acting in the context of one kind of, one context. But I think that, I think film and scripted content, right? Because journalism is non-scripted, film and kind of acting lives in the scripted world. I think it's a really powerful way, if you look back in history, of reaching people and helping them shift and helping to challenge. It's a really effective way to challenge people's perceptions and kind of assumptions, and it can have a lasting effect on humanity. Whereas I think journalism is somewhat limiting in the sense, like, when do you read a news article and feel so inspired? Rarely. But everybody can reference 3 films that quote unquote changed their life or changed their perspective on something, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We keep going back to films. Some of us watch the same film 100 times because there are lessons in films, and it's all based on, the human condition. And again, that's my passion.
That's so interesting. And actually, that's exactly what you've done today, is kind of change the way that, things can be perceived and shed, a new light on those things. So
Hopefully.
I really love what you're doing, and I can't wait to see what you do next. And thank you so much for taking the time to do this today. It really means a lot. I wish we could have seen you in person, though.
Yeah, well, I'm coming soon, and I will make it a point to reach out and to drop by because for as much as I'm focusing on kind of all the stuff we talked about in the US, I think that there's also a role to play in the region in terms of shifting perceptions there. So
definitely,
hopefully soon.
We need you in the region. We need your voice.
We all need each other.
Yeah. All right, Ahmed. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Nadia.
Good luck.
Really my pleasure.
Best of luck.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on social media. Peace. See you soon.